I was grabbing lunch in D.C. recently with a guy who spent 30 years navigating the halls of the federal bureaucracy. He was in a fantastic mood, joking about the sheer scale of the machine he helped run. He told me with a sort of weary pride that there are up to 438 different agencies now. He described it like a sprawling, indestructible cathedral, so big and so complex that it had become too big to fail. To him, the trillions in debt and the hundreds of overseas bases weren't warning signs. They were proof of an empire that had finally outrun the reach of history itself. He truly believed that for the first time in human existence, the rules of gravity simply didn't apply to us. Then I brought up the recent headlines, the capture of the Venezuelan president to secure oil reserves, and the quiet, desperate talk in the halls of power about reimagining the borders with Canada just to secure a reliable, fresh water supply. The change in him was instantaneous. The smugness vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp defensiveness. He didn't offer an economic defense or a policy argument. He just stared at his reflection in the window and muttered something about how the world is a violent place and we have to take what we need to survive. It was a jarring shift from the casual arrogance of a peak civilization to the raw, panicked aggression of one that knows its walls are thinning. It reminded me that every empire, from the Romans to the Ottomans, felt that same surge of invincibility right before the mechanics of the cycle took over. Because what my friend didn't want to admit is that empires don't collapse because of bad luck or a single bad leader. They follow a trajectory as predictable as a heartbeat. Expansion, peak, overextension, and then the inevitable violent slide into the abyss. Looking at the map in 2026, it seems we've reached the part of the story where the violence begins. And, it was the look in his eyes that really stuck with me. It wasn't just offensiveness, it was fear. It was the realization that the cathedral he spent 30 years worshiping might actually be structurally unsound.
Fear is the correct response. When you finally look at the dashboard and realize all the lights are flashing red. I mean, your friend in D.C. is experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance, right?
Exactly.
He's lived his entire career in what you could call the peak phase, the post-Cold War unipolar moment, where, it felt like the U.S. could do no wrong. But the data we have in front of us today, the defense authorizations, the currency analysis, the demographic modeling, it all points to a hard shift into the overextension and decline phase.
And that's what we need to break down today. Not the politics of it, not the headlines, but the mechanics. We talk about empires falling like it's some kind of metaphor, but what you're saying is that it's a mechanical process. It's almost like physics.
It is physics, or at least it operates on principles like physics. Think of it like a system, an engine. Civilizations are systems. They require energy inputs, things like resources, money, human capital, and they produce outputs, security, goods, social stability.
Okay, inputs and outputs.
Right. And when the cost of the inputs exceeds the value of the outputs for too long, the system enters a death spiral. It doesn't matter who the president is. It doesn't matter which party is in charge. If the physics are bad, the building falls.
So let's look at the physics of the U.S. in 2026. For this deep dive, we're going to look at three specific stress points: the military, the money, and the people. And I want to start with the physical reality of the country because I think that's where the divergence is most visible.
The divergence between what we spend our resources on and what we can actually, touch and feel.
I've been spending a lot of time lately looking into the cyclical nature of power, how history isn't just a series of random events, but a predictable rhythm of rise and fall. As a creator who focuses on global shifts, I find that raw numbers like 900 billion often fail to capture the human weight of an empire in its fourth stage. I've come across a few perspectives recently that really put a face on this systemic decay. Imagine a structural engineer named Elias, standing on the edge of a rusted bridge in the American Rust Belt. He's looking at blueprints from the 1950s, marveling at the physical evidence of a time when the state actually built things to last. But today, the federal grants for his project have been frozen again.
The story we hear all the time.
All the time. So I heard that while Elias waits for funding that never comes, he watches the news on his phone. Another massive military aid package sign, another billion-dollar carrier group deployed overseas. To Elias, it feels like living in a house with a collapsing roof, while the owner spends the rent money on a gold-plated security fence at the edge of the property.
That is a perfect analogy for it.
There is a quiet, simmering exhaustion in his eyes, the realization that his country has traded the civilizational resilience of high-speed transit and reliable power for the hollow prestige of global policing. When I read about people like Elias, I feel a sense of mourning for the tangible. It's a reminder that a nation's strength isn't found in its reach, but in its foundation.
Elias is living in the hollowed-out core while watching the resources flow to the periphery. It's not just a feeling he has. The numbers in the National Defense Authorization Act back him up entirely.
Okay.
So if we look at the data we have for the FY 2024 NDAA, the top line number that everyone saw was $883.7 billion.
Just shy of $1 trillion. It's a number so big it's hard to even comprehend.
And that was 2 years ago, so it's higher now. But the really telling part is where that money goes. It's not just defense in the sense of protecting the homeland, it's force projection.
What do you mean by that?
Well, look at the line items. You have something called the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. That was $14.7 billion. You have billions more allocated for the Indo-Pacific Campaigning Initiative.
Campaigning initiative. What does that even mean? It sounds like a marketing slogan.
It almost is. In military terms, campaigning means the logical linking of military activities to achieve a strategic goal. But in practice, what does that mean on a Tuesday? It means moving ships around. It means flying sorties over the ocean. It means conducting joint exercises with allies.
It means burning jet fuel.
It means burning incredible amounts of jet fuel to show the flag. The key thing to understand is that it creates no tangible, lasting asset. Once the fuel is burned, the money is gone. It is an operating expense, not a capital investment.
Versus what Elias the engineer is trying to do, which is pour concrete for a bridge that people will drive on for the next 50, maybe 100 years to get to work, to see their families.
Correct. A capital investment. And this is precisely where the comparison to the rising power, in this case China, gets so uncomfortable for a lot of people. We have the data here from the Global Times on their infrastructure spend through 2025.
And the numbers on their rail system are just staggering.
By the end of 2025, China had hit 165,000 kilometers of total railway. But the number that really matters, the one that points to the future, is the high-speed rail.
Right.
Over 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail. And get this, in just 1 year, 2025 alone, they invested 901.5 billion yuan into new rail assets.
Which in US dollars is what?
At the time, that was about $129 billion.
Okay, so hold on a second. Let's put those two things side by side. We spend $14.7 billion on a deterrence initiative, which is, as you said, basically gas money for ships.
And salaries and maintenance, yes, and operating costs.
And in the same period, they spent $129 billion on permanent, physical, high-speed rail infrastructure.
And that $129 billion creates a tangible asset that lowers the cost of transport for their entire economy. It increases productivity. It connects cities. It will generate economic returns for the next 50 years. That is the definition of state capacity. It's the ability of the state to actually build things.
This is what you always hear. Isn't the Chinese economy crashing? We hear constantly about their real estate bubble, the ghost cities, the mountains of debt. How can they be the rising power if their whole economy is supposedly in so much trouble?
And it's probably the most important distinction to make in this whole conversation. It's the difference between financial health and physical capacity.
Okay.
Yes, their real estate developers like Evergrande are bankrupt. Yes, their local governments have a lot of debt. Their stock market is incredibly volatile. But the trains still run. The factories still exist. The ports are the most automated in the world. Even if the financing was a complete mess, the physical asset remains.
So if the Chinese economy has a major financial crash tomorrow, the high-speed rail network is still physically there.
Exactly.
But if the U.S. economy has a major financial crash, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative vanishes overnight because we can no longer afford the fuel and the salaries. There's nothing left.
The rising power builds assets. The declining power spends on maintenance and policing its existing system. It's a fundamental difference between capital expenditure and operating expenditure. We are, in effect, burning our national capital to maintain a global military position that is becoming more expensive by the day.
And Elias, the engineer on the rusted bridge, he sees this. He doesn't need to read a think tank report. He sees the physical evidence of a time when the U.S. was the rising power, that 1950s bridge, and he compares it to the hollow prestige of a news alert about a carrier group.
He's seeing the opportunity cost in real time. Every single dollar spent maintaining one of our 128 bases in 50 countries is a dollar that wasn't spent upgrading the power grid in Ohio or repairing the water pipes in Michigan. In the early stages of an empire, what we could call phase 1 and phase 2, you could afford both. You're running a surplus, you're expanding. But we are well into phase 4 now. We have a massive deficit. We are forced to choose, and the political system, the imperial system, is consistently choosing the gold-plated fence over fixing the roof.
Which brings us to the really obvious question. How are we paying for the fence? Because we don't actually have the tax revenue to cover a nearly $1 trillion defense budget and everything else.
Not even close. We borrow it.
Yeah.
Or to be more precise, we print it.
And this leads directly to the second warning light flashing on the dashboard itself, the currency. And to understand this, I want to talk about someone else. I want to talk about Jim.
The steelworker you mentioned.
A former steelworker. He was a floor manager at a mill in Pennsylvania for 30 years. This is a guy who used to measure the health of the world by the heat of a furnace, by the port throughput of heavy goods, tangible things. Economy. Now, the mill is shuttered. His pension, which was supposed to be rock solid, was moved into a high-risk hedge fund to chase higher returns. He spends his days staring at a screen, trying to understand speculative markets.
He's been forced out of the real economy and into the financial economy.
And he hates every second of it. He feels like it's all fake, like it's a casino. He made this comparison that I thought was so powerful. He read a story somewhere about Roman coins being shaved down, losing their silver content until they were just worthless tin.
Wow.
And he says he feels the same currency debasement in his own life, not just in the rising price of eggs, but in the shift from making things to moving imaginary numbers around. He sees the systemic economic decay in the way his town's main street is now dominated by payday loan shops rather than factories. It's a jarring shift from the physical to the financial. And honestly, reading his story makes me feel uneasy. While it's easy to dismiss this as economic evolution, we have to acknowledge the deep psychological toll it takes on a population when the tangible output of their labor vanishes into the ether of Wall Street.
Jim is more of a historian than he realizes. The shaving of the coin is the classic textbook mechanism of imperial decline. It's a process called debasement.
So walk us through that, because today we think of inflation as this abstract concept, like prices are just going up. But in Rome, it was a physical, tangible act of fraud, wasn't it?
It was absolutely physical. Okay, so in the time of the first emperor, Augustus, the main silver coin, the denarius, was about 95% pure silver. It was what we call intrinsic money. The value was in the metal itself.
Meaning if the empire collapsed tomorrow, you still had a little piece of silver in your hand that was worth something.
Correct. It was a store of value independent of faith in the state. But then the cycle kicks in. The empire stops expanding. The loot from new conquests stops flowing in. But the costs, the army, the giant bureaucracy, the bread and circuses in Rome, they keep going up. So the emperors have a problem. They need more money. They don't want to tax the wealthy elites, the senators, because the elites have a nasty habit of assassinating emperors who tax them too much.
They mess with the money.
They get creative. They issue a decree. All old coins must be turned in. They melt them down, mix in some cheap metal like copper, and then they mint more coins with the same face value. Certainly, they have more coins to pay the soldiers.
But each coin has less silver.
Right. And they did this over and over again. By the late 3rd century, during the reign of the Emperor Gallienus, the silver Antonianus coin had less than 5% silver in it. It was basically a copper slug with a thin silver wash that would rub off in your hand.
So the government was literally stealing the wealth of its citizens, the silver, out of their savings and replacing it with worthless copper, just hoping no one would notice.
Oh, people noticed. Prices for everything skyrocketed. Soldiers started demanding to be paid in gold or even in salt and grain because the silver coins were worthless. And this process destroyed the trust in the state. The money shifted from being a store of value to being a purely fiduciary instrument. Its value is based entirely on faith in the government, and that faith was collapsing.
And Jim, our steel worker, feels this happening right now. But we don't use silver coins. We use digital dollars on a screen. So how are we shaving the dollar today?
We just use fancier names for it. We call it quantitative easing or monetary expansion. But the mechanic is absolutely identical. When the U.S. government needs to pay for that $883 billion defense budget and it doesn't have the tax revenue, it issues debt in the form of treasury bonds.
And then the Federal Reserve steps in?
The Federal Reserve steps in and creates new dollars digitally out of thin air to buy those bonds from the big banks. It's a closed loop.
Which dilutes the entire existing pool of dollars already in circulation.
Exactly. The silver content of your paycheck goes down every time they do this. This is why Jim feels like he's running on a treadmill. The numbers on the screen for his hedge fund pension might be going up, but the purchasing power of those numbers, what they can actually buy in the real world, is steadily dropping.
And that's the concept of illusory wealth that you see in the work of people like John Malden and Ray Dalio, right?
Exactly. In the bubble phase of the cycle, which is where we are, financial assets boom. The stock market hits record highs. Real estate prices in major cities explode. The elites, the top 10%, who own most of those assets, feel incredibly rich. They look at their portfolios and say, see, the economy's booming.
But Jim, who doesn't own a big portfolio, he just sees the price of eggs and gasoline doubling.
He sees the very nature of work and value changing in front of his eyes. He sees that making things, actual production, doesn't pay anymore. What pays is moving money around, speculation. So the town's factory, which produced tangible value, closes, and what opens up on Main Street? Payday loan shops, check cashing places, pawn shops.
The economy begins to cannibalize itself.
But it stops generating new wealth and starts creating more efficient ways to extract the remaining wealth from the bottom 90%. A payday loan shop is a tool of extraction, not production.
That's a grim image. The payday loan shop as the modern equivalent of that copper slug with the silver wash.
It's the financialization of decay. You aren't building a future anymore. You are simply placing bets on the scraps of the past. And this creates a massive psychological toll. Jim isn't just feeling poorer, he feels swindled. He knows instinctively that the game is rigged, even if he can't explain the complex derivatives market. He knows the silver is gone from the coin.
And when you have millions of Jims who feel swindled and millions of Eliases who see the physical infrastructure crumbling around them, you don't just have an economic problem anymore. You have a social bomb that is ticking.
And that brings us directly to the third and final mechanic of the cycle, internal fragmentation, the social fabric tearing apart.
So to understand this piece, let's talk about Maya. She's the demographic opposite of Jim. She's young, in her 20s, a first-generation college graduate. She did everything she was told to do. She got good grades, took on the student loans, got the degree, moved to a major city for opportunities.
She was chasing the promise of intergenerational mobility, the American dream.
The American dream, exactly. But now she's working 3 different gig economy jobs just to pay her share of the rent for a single room in a shared apartment. She has no benefits, no job security, and absolutely zero hope of ever being able to afford a house in the city she lives in. For her, the social contract feels like a complete and total lie.
Maya is a perfect data point for Peter Turchin's structural demographic theory. Turchin has this fascinating and frankly unsettling mathematical formula for predicting periods of political instability. He calls it the political stress indicator, or PSI.
I always find it wild when historians and sociologists try to use math to predict revolutions. It seems improbable. How does that formula even work?
Well, it's a combination of 2 main factors, which he argues consistently appear before major upheavals. The first is mass mobilization potential, and the second is elite mobilization potential. Maya's story is the very essence of mass mobilization potential.
Which is just a fancy way of saying a lot of angry people.
It begins with what he calls popular immiseration. This happens when real wages for the bottom 90% stagnate or decline for a long period, while the cost of living, specifically the cost of elite goods like higher education and housing in good neighborhoods, skyrockets. Familiar?
That's been the story for 40 years.
Exactly. But Turchin adds a crucial multiplier to this, the youth bulge.
A lot of young people in the population.
A lot of educated young people who cannot find a place in the society's elite structure that matches their credentials. This is what he calls the counter-elite problem, and it's incredibly dangerous for any state.
Counter-elite? That sounds like a term from a spy novel context.
Yes. If you have a starving, uneducated peasant, they are miserable, but they're usually too busy trying to find their next meal to successfully organize and overthrow the government. But if you have a starving law school graduate with $150,000 in debt, that person is a threat.
Because they know how the system works. They know how to organize, how to write, how to speak. They have access to information.
Maya is educated. She has ambitions. She has expectations that society put in her head. When those expectations are crushed, she doesn't just get sad. She gets radicalized. She has the skills to become a leader for all the other discontented people. Historically, almost every single major revolution is led not by the poor, but by these counter-elites, people who were qualified to be part of the ruling class, but were shut out.
Robespierre was a lawyer, wasn't he?
Lenin was a lawyer. Fidel Castro was a lawyer. It's a repeating pattern. When you create a large class of credentialed, ambitious people and then provide them with no economic future, they will eventually try to burn the entire system down.
But you mentioned a second part of the formula, elite mobilization. So it's not just the masses, the rich are fighting each other too.
This is the other half of the pressure cooker, and it's just as important. Turchin calls this elite overproduction. Think of it as a giant game of musical chairs. Yeah. In a growing, expanding empire, there are always plenty of chairs. The economic pie is getting bigger, so new elites can be created and accommodated without displacing the old ones. But in a declining, stagnating empire phase 4, the pie stops growing, or even shrinks.
But the number of people who want to be elites keeps growing.
It grows rapidly.
Yeah.
Our university system has become a factory for producing elite credentials. The financial system creates new millionaires and billionaires every year. So you have this huge overproduction of elites, all fighting for a relatively fixed number of power positions: senator, governor, CEO, university president.
So you have 10 people fighting for one chair.
Exactly. And when 10 powerful, wealthy, ambitious people fight for one chair, what happens? They stop following the rules. The norms of political behavior break down. They start using dirty tactics. They weaponize the legal system against each other. They use the media to destroy their rivals. They polarize the electorate to build their own power bases.
That sounds exactly like the political environment of 2026. It's not just ideological disagreement anymore. It feels like a blood sport, a death match for the remaining spoils of a declining system.
And crucially, they use the angry masses, people like Maya, as their battering rams. One faction of elites will tap into Maya's legitimate anger and say, "It's their fault you're poor, follow me." The other faction of elites does the exact same thing. This is what tears the social fabric of a country completely apart.
And this is where the Eastern perspective that I mentioned starts to become relevant, because Maya, sitting in her rented room, looks at the chaos in DC, the gridlock, the constant shouting matches, the political violence on her social media feed, and then she looks at a place like China.
And whatever its many, many faults, what she sees is institutional efficacy. She sees a government that can, for better or worse, actually build a high-speed rail network in a decade. For a generation in the West that has grown up with nothing but gridlock, decay, and decline, the idea of simple competence becomes an incredibly seductive ideology.
She starts to wonder if our democratic process is just a cover for elite looting. And if their authoritarian system, while repressive, at least gets things done, it's a critical failure of state capacity.
It is the ultimate crisis of legitimacy, when the state completely loses the mandate of heaven, the basic belief that it is acting in the best interest of the majority of its people. It creates a power vacuum. And history, as we know, abhors a vacuum.
So let's just quickly recap the dashboard here. We have military overextension represented by Elias, we have economic debasement represented by Jim, and we have social fragmentation represented by Maya. The internal system is cracking under immense pressure. But of course, we don't live in a bubble. While all this is happening on the inside, the world is changing rapidly on the outside.
This is the critical shift to geopolitics. The end of one era and the beginning of another. It's the move from globalization to bare-knuckle survival.
Right, we have this source here from Aaron Friedberg about the concept of decoupling. For a long time, for decades really, the dominant theory was one world. The idea that trade and economic integration would inevitably bring peace.
It was the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. The idea that no two countries with McDonald's would ever go to war with each other. That was the height of 1990s optimism. It was a nice idea, but it fundamentally assumed that everyone wanted to eventually become a liberal democracy just like us.
But that's not what happened. And now, instead of one world, we have two worlds forming. The blue bloc, led by the US and its allies, and the red bloc, led by China and its partners.
And they are actively separating from each other. China, for instance, is pursuing a national strategy they call dual circulation. Except you can think of it like an airlock on a spaceship.
Okay, an airlock.
They want to keep one door open to the outside world to keep selling their goods, external circulation. But at the same time, they are trying to build a completely self-reliant domestic economy that is immune to outside pressure. Internal circulation.
They're preparing for a siege. They're trying to make themselves sanction-proof.
They are absolutely immunizing themselves against U.S. sanctions. They saw what happened to Russia's foreign reserves in 2022. They know the U.S. weaponizes the dollar and the SWIFT system. So they are methodically decoupling on their own terms before a potential conflict forces them to.
And the word conflict isn't just a metaphor anymore, is it? Let's go back to the very beginning, to my conversation in D.C. and the headlines about Venezuela and Canada. My friend there said, we have to take what we need to survive.
That is the raw, unveiled language of a system in a new phase. This is the transition from an empire of influence to an empire of extraction.
What's the difference?
When you are rich and growing, you use soft power. You trade. You invest. You buy influence with foreign aid. When you are declining and resource constrained, you revert to hard power. You steal.
So the capture of the Venezuelan president to secure oil reserves, that's not spreading democracy or nation building. That's a raid.
It's a resource grab, pure and simple. The U.S. system needs a stable, cheap supply of oil to function. Venezuela has it. So the niceties of international law and sovereignty are thrown out the window when the empire becomes desperate enough.
In the Canada situation, the quiet talk about reimagining borders to secure fresh water supplies, that sounds completely insane. Canada is supposed to be our closest ally.
Is it insane? Or is it just history rhyming? Look at the British Empire during the Boer War.
In South Africa, late 1800s.
Right. The British Empire was beginning to fade. They were losing their industrial and economic dominance to Germany and the United States. But the Boer republics in South Africa were sitting on the largest gold and diamond deposits in the world. The British needed that hard currency, that specie, to prop up the pound sterling and the City of London. So they invaded.
And it was in a gentleman's war, from what I remember.
It was horrific. They invented the concentration camp. They systematically rounded up Boer women and children and put them in camps where tens of thousands died of disease and starvation, all to break the will of the resistance fighters. Why? Because they needed the gold. Desperation breeds brutality. When an empire runs out of options for easy growth, it starts cannibalizing its friends and neighbors.
So the trial balloons about buying Greenland a few years ago, or the new pressure on Canada over water, these aren't jokes. They're the early warning signs of a predator that is running out of food in its traditional hunting grounds.
Correct. We are entering a new era of resource wars. The geopolitical context of 2026 and beyond is going to be defined by scarcity. Scarcity of water, of energy, of rare earth minerals. The gloves are coming off globally.
We've mapped out all these symptoms of decline, but I keep coming back to the fundamental why. If we have all these smart people, my friend in DC said 438 federal agencies full of experts, why can't we stop it? Why couldn't the Romans just decide to stop debasing the coin? Why can't we just decide to trim the defense budget and fix Elias's bridge?
And to answer it, you have to look at the work of an anthropologist named Joseph Tainter.
Right, the collapse of complex societies.
Tainter is essential reading for this moment.
Yeah.
His core theory is about the law of diminishing returns on complexity.
Break that down for us, because normally we think complexity is a good thing, right? It means we have specialized medicine and iPhones and indoor plumbing.
And initially it is. In the early stages of a civilization, adding a layer of complexity solves problems very efficiently. You create a police force, crime goes down, trade flourishes, the benefit far exceeds the cost. You build an irrigation bureaucracy, crop yields skyrocket. It's a high return on investment.
So naturally, we just keep adding more and more layers.
You keep adding layers, more agencies, more regulations, more laws, more specialized technology. But eventually you hit a tipping point. All the low-hanging fruit problems have been solved. Now every new problem you face requires a massive, incredibly expensive, and highly complex solution that costs more than the benefit actually provides.
Like spending $14.7 billion on a deterrence initiative that doesn't actually stop the rival power from building more ships.
Example. Or creating a new government agency to provide oversight for the previous agency that failed. The cathedral, your friend described, 438 agencies. That is the very definition of the complexity trap. The system becomes so dense, so interconnected, that it consumes all of the society's energy surplus just to maintain its own existence. It can't adapt or solve new problems. It can only feed itself.
So too big to fail really just means too complex to change.
Yes. If you actually try to reform it, say you genuinely want to cut that defense budget in half to build high-speed rail, you would trigger a catastrophic cascade of failure. You'd have to lay off hundreds of thousands of workers in 50 states. You would crash the stock prices of the biggest defense contractors, which in turn would crash the pension funds of people like Jim, the steelworker.
So the politicians are paralyzed. They know the system is unsustainable, but they can't touch any single piece of it without risking the collapse of the whole thing.
There was a fascinating computer modeling study done by the historians Roman and Palmer, where they looked at the fall of the Western Roman Empire. They ran a complex simulation to see if the empire could have been saved.
A historical what-if scenario. I love these.
And the model found a solution. It found a pathway to survival. But it was incredibly radical. To save the empire, the Roman state would have needed to do two things immediately. Stop the debasement of the currency, cold turkey, and this is the most important part, drastically shrink the size of the army and the territory it controlled.
They needed to retreat, give up Britain, give up Gaul, pull the legions back to Italy, North Africa, come home.
Exactly. Consolidate, simplify, return to a smaller, more manageable, and more defensible core. The model showed that if they had done that, a version of the Roman state might have survived for another 500 years.
But they didn't do it. Not.
Because of the elites, the senators, the generals, the wealthy landowning families. To shrink the empire would mean giving up their massive agricultural estates in Gaul. To stop debasing the coin would mean they would have to pay much higher taxes out of their own pockets to honestly fund the state.
So they chose to protect their personal wealth and power over ensuring civilizational survival.
They chose what the model calls neutral stability. They kept the appearance of the great empire alive. They kept the lavish parties going in Rome. They kept the legions marching at the frontiers. But they were eating the seed corn to do it. They refused to accept a managed decline in their own standard of living, and in doing so, they guaranteed the total catastrophic collapse of the entire system for everyone.
That feels almost unbearably relevant to 2026. We know on some level that we need to shrink our global footprint. We know we need to get our debt under control. But no politician can ever get elected on a platform of managed decline.
Can you imagine the campaign slogan? Vote for me, I will cut your benefits and give up our global military bases. It's political suicide. So we stay the course. We keep driving the car toward the cliff because stepping on the brakes is politically impossible.
So how does it finally end? We have this French source, Les Empires se font, empires collapse, and it argues that the end isn't usually some big fiery apocalypse or a nuclear war. It's often much quieter than that.
It's what you could call the Berlin Wall moment, the silence of collective disillusionment.
Explain what you mean by that.
Think about the Soviet Union in 1989. On paper, they were still a formidable superpower. They had thousands of nuclear warheads, they had the KGB, they had a massive army stationed in East Germany. But on that night in November, when the crowds of ordinary people gathered at the wall, the guards didn't shoot.
They just opened the gates. They just watched.
They checked out. Mentally and spiritually, they had checked out of the system. The system had lost all its legitimacy. The gap between the official propaganda, we are the glorious workers' paradise on the path to communism, and the daily reality, we have to stand in line for 6 hours for a loaf of bread, became too wide to bridge. The guards, the people, the bureaucrats, they just stopped believing in the story.
The mandate of heaven was gone.
And once the collective belief is gone, the power evaporates overnight. A state, a currency, an empire. It's ultimately just a collective agreement. It's a story we all agree to believe in. If we all agree the dollar is worth something, it is. If we all agree the laws matter, they do. But if that belief shatters.
And some of the source material notes that public trust in the U.S. federal government is hovering at historic lows, somewhere around 23%. That's dangerously close to the checking out point.
That is the Phase 5 trigger. The ultimate risk for the United States isn't that a Chinese army invades California. The risk is that the American people, the Jims, the Mayas, the Eliases, simply stop showing up for the empire. They stop buying the debt. They stop enlisting in the military. They stop paying their taxes. They quietly withdraw their consent to be governed by that system.
Then the indestructible cathedral with its 438 agencies just crumbles under his own weight, not with a bang, but with a whisper.
It turns out it was made of sand all along.
Epic. We started with the physical divergence, Elias the engineer seeing the rust on the bridge, while China pours high-speed concrete. We moved to the financial illusion, Jim the steelworker watching the silver vanish from his wages. We looked at the social breaking point, Maya the graduate finding all the doors to the future locked. And we've seen how this internal decay forces the system into violent resource extraction abroad, all while being paralyzed by its own suffocating complexity.
It is a sobering picture, but it's so important to remember. This is a cycle. Expansion, peak, overextension, decline. It's not a moral judgment on a people. It's a mechanism. It's a pattern that has played out again and again throughout history.
The structural engineer, the steel worker, the gig worker, they all feel the ground shifting long before the headlines and the capital catch up. We look at maps and see borders. History looks at maps and sees energy flows. And right now, the energy is moving. The indestructible cathedral my friend described in D.C. might look permanent from the inside, but so did the Colosseum, and so did the Berlin Wall. The scariest thing isn't the violence of the collapse. It's the quiet realization that by the time you can finally see the cracks in the foundation, the roof has already begun to fall.